Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me.
Oh my God!
What's going on, everybody? I hope you're having a good week. So for a long time now, I've wanted to make this video, and I've been thinking about this specific possibility for most of last year, especially after watching that Resident Evil show on Netflix. And just saying those words, Resident Evil and Netflix, sounds like a disaster. So you already know from my tone that that show wasn't anywhere near what I was expecting. And this year, after watching The Last of Us so far, I can't help but just think about the possibilities of what a good Resident Evil movie or show could be like. And that begs the question, how the heck are we going to get a good Resident Evil show or movie if Capcom keeps hiring these cheap, inexperienced, or just straight up insane directors to work on them? And I really want this topic to trend, so if you can hit that like button and subscribe, that would help a lot. And maybe this could be a possibility to get something as good as The Last of Us. And yes, I love every single episode of this show so far. I think the pacing is perfect. I think everything they show from the Left Behind episode to episode 3 was beautiful and a masterpiece. And if you disagree with that or have an issue with episode 3 specifically, that's a topic for another video. And ever since the early 2000s, when we got movies like Resident Evil Degeneration and the original live action films by Paul W.S. Anderson, those adaptations left something to be desired, to say the least. They either went off the wall to a completely different direction, or with most of the CGI movies, they just left you feeling sort of empty and without as much substance as most of the games had. And as a kid, I just ate any kind of Resident Evil media up. I used to buy the comics, and I even used to buy the HD collections, even though I already had the games, just to get those free movie tickets for the Mila Jovovich Resident Evil movies. And I simply loved Resident Evil Apocalypse, but watching them as an adult is completely different. I can still appreciate the concept of the movie, the fact that it's trying to be something Resident Evil related, but in practice, watching it over and over again, it's just a ridiculous action movie that has Resident Evil elements sprinkled in. So suffice to say, I don't really like the movies anymore, and I find them insufferable to rewatch, even though the new movie, Welcome to Raccoon City, and its painfully mediocre presentation and execution made the original movie seem much more interesting. But there's a specific movie I saw last year that made me realize there is a director that would be perfect to either direct a streaming series or a movie. And that movie was Malignant, directed by James Wan. Now, first of all, the poster for that film looks exactly like The Evil Within. And I was sort of upset because it was sort of biting off of that game's style. But after watching the film, it totally feels as ridiculous as The Evil Within would be, and is just bat crap crazy by the end of it. It has horror, disturbing scenes, and action sprinkled in perfectly, and they all impress equally, which, if it sounds familiar, is sort of like what Resident Evil is known for these days, where you would see a character that's seemingly helpless ultimately become capable and impressive, like Leon S. Kennedy in Resident Evil 4, and like a lot of people will see in the remake. And I just think James Wan's style, given the fact that he made The Conjuring 1 and 2, and a movie as ridiculous as Malignant, it shows how vast his range actually is, and the fact that he can handle disturbing, subtle, and perfectly timed horror scenes, and also fast-paced, impressive, and insane action sequences. And I did hear some subtle rumors that James Wan was talking about making a Resident Evil series, or he wanted to make one at some point, and that kind of made me excited, but then I never saw it years later, so I'm assuming they dropped the idea. Capcom definitely needs to get back on that horse, and they need to take off with that idea, specifically with James Wan leading the series or the movie's directions. I mean, the guy's just making Conjuring movies all the time, but he does spend a good amount of time on each movie, so we only have a few under his name, but he is responsible for a lot of great modern horror films. And who better to take on the job to actually make a good Resident Evil movie or show? I mean, that's unheard of, and it would be so easy to make it. I don't understand why the timeline of the shows or movies never quite get justice, or never appropriately portray how exciting and convoluted they are in the video games. And I'm just assuming it was mainly all of the director's faults, and they simply just weren't skilled enough to convey a complicated story and history like Resident Evil to the big screen. And well, just saying it out loud, it just sounds like a perfect idea to get James Wan on a Resident Evil project. I mean, the guy made Aquaman, and that movie was arguably the best DC movie in a very long time. I just love the visuals and the ridiculousness, and the comedy in the movie actually landed for me. He also had something to do with one of the best Fast and Furious movies, which was the most memorable one, Furious 7. And let's not forget he worked on the original Saw. And when a director like James Wan takes full control, you get movies like The Conjuring and The Conjuring 2, which aren't horror movies to be laughed at. Insidious 1 was also pretty terrifying, and kind of like an alternate The Shining, where the main character has these supernatural powers and they automatically have to fight their fears. I mean, if that doesn't sound familiar enough to get everybody on that Resident Evil bandwagon for James Wan, I don't know what is. A lot of James Wan's movies focused on conquering your fears and working with the cards that you're dealt. And that just sounds like survival horror to its core. And yes, the Saw films after a while started to get old, but I remember Saw 1 the most, and that crazy twist at the end. If there's anything this guy's good at, it's subverting expectations, which would also work for the Resident Evil franchise. Seeing how most of the Resident Evil fan base are know-it-alls, I mean, I should know I'm one of them. Subverting our expectations, thinking one character is doing one thing when he's actually doing another, or a story element is one way, but it actually is a different way, would help to surprise the audience that's familiar with this series as well as newcomers. And yes, he recently had something to do with the new Megan movie, and there's a lot of people out there that didn't quite like the film. They thought it could be better, but James Wan didn't direct that film. He just made the story, which again seemed to be the most interesting part of the movie. And he's just really awesome at making concepts for horror films. Just the concept alone for his movies pull you in. So not only would he make a badass Resident Evil film with a lot of awesome monsters like he's used to making, but just the presentation of those films will draw you in alone to make the world of Resident Evil that much more interesting and hopefully inspire the games to change their direction as well, because it seems like the games are focusing more on redoing what worked in the past and remaking what happened already. The new ideas started to happen around Umbrella Chronicles, Resident Evil 5 and 6. Even though those were the least successful in terms of criticism out of the Resident Evil franchise, they were undoubtedly the most creative. And it was mostly because of Paul W.S. Anderson's implementations that added something to the films and in turn the video games as well. So just imagine if a seasoned horror director like James Wan gets a crack at the Resident Evil story and how he would change it for the better. Because yes, Resident Evil Village was a different direction, but there were a lot of story elements that seemed like it was taking a safe backseat to the other extending parts of the Resident Evil universe. It wasn't going in a totally new direction to the point that you're going to wonder what is the next part going to be. It seemed to have more of a closed off storyline, and it felt sort of like a spin-off at times, especially with the first person perspective. I think even Resident Evil 7 had an isolated incident sort of storyline. And yes, Resident Evil does take place in a lot of isolated incident scenarios, but they seem to change the future forever, most of the time. And with 7 and 8, I feel like after they ended, there's no way that they're going to lead to the future. And seeing how they just closed off the story with Rose and Ethan with just the DLC, it doesn't seem like they had a ton of faith in this new direction. And I'm hoping that Capcom has something up their sleeves, like hiring James Wan to make new movies, to have new inspiration for new games. Because even though the original Resident Evil did make a concept all on its own, it was highly inspired by George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. They even wanted George A. Romero to write the script for the first Resident Evil movie. The inspiration for that film made an entire franchise, and we can't just not face the fact that a lot of video games nowadays are inspired by movies. Art inspires art in general. So if you have a legendary director like James Wan taking on a legendary franchise like Resident Evil, that would make all of the weight and all of the suffering through these mediocre movies and shows actually worth the wait. I just really hope James Wan for Resident Evil trends in some kind of way, because even though you have all of these Resident Evil channels, I always get disappointed when they don't have ideas on how to fix the franchise, when they either just accept the franchise for its mediocre qualities and not present new ideas, or just like a lot of the games and movies, they make nostalgia the core element of the channel, when I feel like Resident Evil has always been about infinite possibilities. And I'm not saying that I don't like Resident Evil Village. I did like it. I feel like it's a solid 7 out of 10, and what they did with it was good enough. But did it blow me away as much as games like Resident Evil 4, 2, and 3 did? No. And it's been a very long time since a Resident Evil game has done that. RE7 sort of did that, but it mostly felt like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and you can see the inspiration there. I feel like that theme has been run down to the point it's kind of obvious what it's based on. And I get that the regal, classical movie type feel to the the series is what makes it special. But mostly what I'm saying is it would be pretty awesome to see what kind of new ideas James Wan can bring to the world of Resident Evil as well. I feel like what makes exciting ideas is surprising change. And so far, Leon hasn't changed much in the series. Chris hasn't changed much. I feel like even though Resident Evil is about evolution, the series is almost terrified of change in the way that it presents its world. And it did revolutionize video games by solidifying the survival horror genre. I just feel like the series is still stuck in the past, in a sense, and there's just something missing. And I believe that thing that is missing is a great movie to inspire even more amazing sequels. Just like with the Batman Arkham series, The Dark Knight heavily inspired the video games, and the director Sefton Hill admitted to that as well. I just hope that one day we can see a Resident Evil series or movie directed by James Wan. I hope and pray for that, because I don't know if Capcom already tried or if they even attempted to recruit James Wan to work on an RE movie or show, but I'm just so surprised they didn't think about it or try harder. I mean, Capcom is an extremely successful video game company, and there is an incredible movie in this franchise, but so far most directors haven't seen it yet. They either made it into a gimmicky action film or a scared to express itself show or movie. I want to see the world of Resident Evil appropriately represented and the monsters in it come to life in all the best ways on the big screen. And there has been talk that because the remakes look so realistic that it would be hard to give us that feeling again. But The Last of Us proves that wrong after seeing The Last of Us 1 remake and 2 and seeing how they obviously look way more realistic than a Resident Evil game. Seeing how the shows can make us feel the same thing but in a different way proves that it's not too late for the Resident Evil franchise either. And I think that James Wan is the guy to make that happen. I mean, I'm not going to send an army after him, but if you can contact him and give him the idea, just like I did, just be that crazy fan for once. Then hopefully we can have an appropriate director to take on the series, because to me, he checks off all the boxes of a Resident Evil movie director. He has that disturbing take on biological horrors shown in Malignant, and that disturbed mind that can fully encapsulate a horrifying atmosphere like with the Conjuring sequels, and that ridiculous, satisfying, over-the-top action like on Aquaman and even Malignant, showing characters face impossible odds with terrifying imagery and overcoming it by the end, just like with all of the games. And seeing with Megan how he's sort of taking a back seat, maybe it's time for him to step up and get more into his element with the Resident Evil series. I just feel like he would be right at home. And let me know what you guys think about this idea. Do you think James Wan is a perfect director to work on a Resident Evil series or movie? Or do you have another idea for a different director to save the movie franchise? And thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Later.